special creation. So come take a look, give me the hook or the ovation. It's my world that I want to have a little pride in. My world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say I am what I am.
We're delighted to have as our guest on LGBTlife, Senator Jillian van Turnhout. Jillian, welcome to LGBTlife and Dublin City FM.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be on it.
Jillian, a week or so ago, we've just had the passage of the historic Gender Recognition Bill. Just if we could step back from that, trans as a subject matter, when and how did you get involved in it initially?
I suppose it'd be difficult for me to pinpoint the exact, but I know it was only a few years ago. It's not that long ago. I previously, about 17, 18 years ago, Michael would have worked at a European level for a European Youth Platform. And then I got involved in LGBT rights and certainly looking at funding with the European Commission and all of that area. And since I was appointed as Senator just over 4 years ago, this is one of the issues that came up, and my colleague Senator Captain Sapone was doing the bill on gender recognition and she asked me to co-sponsor it. And I tried, and we put in that it would be open to all, so is that including children and young people, because for my work I have a particular focus on putting a children's rights lens on all legislation. So when the bill was being debated at committee and in the Dáil, I took attention to it and started reading into the subject, seeing that I could add my support to colleagues on the issue. So more from that perspective, as a human rights issue, that this will be something. But it's an issue that really, it's very difficult to explain how much. It's one of the issues that has affected me the most in the Senate as a human rights issue, because I've had the privilege to meet people in the trans community who've had to share their lives with me and explain to me the importance of the legislation that we were working on. Now, for anybody to have to do that for legislation, you know, it's very emotional, it's a very real, and you know that this legislation will impact on their daily lives. It's not an abstract theory or people that you don't know their faces. So for me, my introduction was gradual, but it's one of those, once you start immersing yourself in the subject, you say, hold on, why aren't we doing more? Why are we only taking baby steps? You know, in the background, I would have been very conscious of Lydia Foy and her case, of Michael Farrell, his amazing work that he's done, and the respect I would have for him. So I would have had an interest, but not an understanding.
Just on that very basis, when I got involved, I suddenly had to step back and think, well, you thought you knew something about this, and then you realise, well, you got to throw all the, I won't say prejudices, but pre-knowledge out the window and start again from scratch. Was that something you found yourself?
Most definitely, and especially when you're looking at the area of children, because we're only beginning to really understand, and research is only really, you know, there was anecdotal evidence, but actually having research evidence that you could rely on for legislation. So it's something I've had to immerse myself and look globally to understand what is happening. But what has surprised me is when you look globally at the countries who are taking progressive moves, and it is a shame that for all our equality and all that we're talking about, that it has taken us a court case to get us to bring forward this legislation. And it was only for the courage of Lydia Foy that we are at this stage. In my belief, I wonder, would we be dealing with this legislation?
Yes, that's something would be very much to the fore in my thinking as well. We brought in this legislation not because we were suddenly enlightened, we were compelled to from the European courts. That's your understanding as well?
That's my understanding, and it's still my feeling if I look at what we've brought in the legislation. Now, it did change greatly from the time of introduction of the legislation to having a statutory declaration when we voted on the final stage last week. But I still feel we're doing it because we're obliged to do it. Not everybody is convinced that we should do it. I believe it's the right thing to do. I believe we should go further. I believe we should trust people. I often heard during the debate the marriage equality referendum cited, but in fact it was a family member for me who drew the best reference, I thought, from the marriage equality referendum. Said, you know, Gillian, one thing I learned from that referendum, we need to let people live as they wish to live. And I thought that was it.
That's a very interesting point, Julian, because when I've been saying to people, and I know it's very early days, of what did we actually get out of the marriage equality? What's the change in thinking? And the interpretation I'm putting on it, and I hope I'm not askew on this, is that we changed from a hierarchical system to a relational system. The very word you use, trust, to me, is we started trusting Irish people. Is that a reasonable analysis?
I think it's a reasonable analysis, and I think we have to be careful that we don't draw too much from the marriage equality referendum. In the, you know, it was a magical moment, it was momentous, but I think it gave people a greater understanding of the challenges that people are facing in their daily lives. And so for me, what we need to draw is to allow people to live as they wish to live. And my husband is Dutch, and everybody thinks the Dutch are really liberal people. In fact, the Dutch are very conservative people, and I wonder sometimes if we could adopt some of their culture, because what they are is they're conservative in their own lives, but they're liberal in how they allow others to operate. So they have this attitude of that balance, of saying, I can still live my life as I wish to live. That doesn't stop me allowing you have your rights to live your life as you wish to live your life.
It's fascinating you should say this, because a few years ago when we were looking as though Ireland was going belly up economically, and I was with another radio station, and I said to people, if Ireland ceased to be in the morning, what other European nationality, I was talking about merging, I said, would you like to be? And interesting, you know, a few people wanted to be Italians, a few people wanted to be Swedes. I was the only one who wanted to be Dutch. For that very reason.
I'm in good company.
Well, no, it's for that very reason is that my experience in the Netherlands is that they take the other into consideration, particularly in business. In other words, business is harmonious. It's not, I won't say they're not competitive. Do you think that is something we learned along the way in the evolution of the towards the gender recognition bill? Because if I go back to the original Gregg report was hierarchical, pure and simple. This is what the central government says. You wear it. How did you feel about that one when you saw it originally?
I was very disappointed, and I think where we've got to now with the bill and now the Act, the Gender Recognition Act, is much better placed to allow people to statutorily declare, rather than having to go through invasions of their own personal sense, of their own physical sense. So for me, perhaps the discussion and the discourse that happened, I think it was good that the legislation commenced in the Seanad. I think the Seanad allows for that more open discussion, and just by sheer nature of where we're all standing, we're standing right beside one another. It's not the trenches in the same way maybe that the Dáil can be seen as. So for me, is we had a very good debate. I would have liked to see the bill go much further. I disappointed, obviously, that with the marriage equality referendum being appealed, that we still have a situation of forced divorce within this legislation, but hopefully that you know, and the government has given a commitment that will be withdrawn as soon as hopefully the appeal it goes through. But certainly that's something, you know, for me, on the children's rights referendum, which I think is equally applies to this bill and legislation, the children's rights amendment, we saw that taken through the courts for 2.5 years.
Let's talk about that very issue, because you and I started to engage, particularly on social media, about this. To me, the issue of children was as important as any other, if not the most important. I'm not too sure other people saw that. I mean, how did you feel when you saw the way that this discussion was panning out? First of all, do you think that the government were moved by the politics as it went along? We talk about that. Clearly there was an element with the marriage equality that took that a forced divorce out. Many people were taken by surprise by the self-declaration, very pleased. Am I being naive or perhaps even cynical of thinking that came out around the same time as the Caitlyn Jenner interview? Was there any impact on what I would call the macro and the micro?
Oh, I think they interchange, and you know, change is incremental, but I think that certainly helped, and the macro context around it. I think on the children's issue, I felt we were up against a brick wall. So in that way, you know, on the statutory declaration for adults, It's really positive. It's the way the bill should have been originally. But fair dues, well done to the Taoiseach and to Minister Kevin Humphreys. It's great to see it, and it's great to see that they've done that. The difficulty for me is if you're under 18, this bill is little or no good to you, because the 16 to 18 year olds will still have to go to an endocrinologist. There's waiting lists, we have 2 in Ireland, you know, so the sheer difficulty. And if you're under 16, the bill has purposely and deliberately decided to ignore you and not to include you in your considerations. And that certainly for me, I probably surprised even myself in February at the committee stage of the bill, because I knew I wished to speak on the issue of children. And when I started researching into it, started meeting parents and young people, trans young people, realising the daily challenges they had with the education system, with the health system, just with the world around them. Very often, you know, in the majority of cases, their parents agreed, their extended family agreed, understood. In fact, in cases were relieved that their child didn't have a health difficulty, that in fact it was that their child was trans. You know, this sense of relief, parents would say, as the awareness came about them, there's nothing wrong with my child. They're trans, that's okay, I can. But then the society and system says we prefer to stick our head in the sand and not deal with this issue. And if we don't deal with it, sure, they'll grow out of it.
That was very much the case I found as well. And you and I have probably spoken to and listened to the same parents. I found it very, very difficult not to be moved by the testimony. Were you concerned the fact that it almost invariably was mothers? I mean, leaving the remarkable Simon Blenkinsey aside, most of the people, most of the testimonies that I've heard, and the ones that I've sent you, have almost been mothers. How do you find that?
It hadn't actually occurred to me until now, Michael, that it was. It tends to be in a lot of children's rights issues that I deal with, that it is mothers. Now, fathers, as you said, people like Simon Blenkinsey is amazing. You know, so you will have individual fathers who will come forward. But I've always been a believer that when you strengthen children's rights, it's actually parents that you're helping. Because if the parent is doing their job as a parent, they want more rights for their child, because it's the parents who will use their pester power to go to the schools, to go to the health system and pester for the rights for their child. But for me, if we look at this bill and if we look at our understanding, you know, and it was very difficult for me, for example, to see that you have a country like Malta who would be extremely conservative and yet are able to not only grapple with the children issue, have such a refreshing attitude and say, you know what, why don't we say until 14 we don't put the gender down on the birth cert, we allow people to just live and see. And they have a single sex education like us, so they will have the same so-called obstacles and they're going to tackle it, and they're able to bring that forward in their legislation. And we have purposely and deliberately decided, you know what, children, you go wait, sit in the corner. Let's forget who ever had a referendum for children. Let's talk about the marriage equality referendum. And that this part of me has a sense of difficulty about this, because I was a big supporter of the marriage equality referendum, but we didn't win the hearts and minds with the children's referendum. And we still have a journey to go to persuade people that gender recognition and other issues are equally children's rights issues.
Okay. Could it be, and I go back to the idea of when we all came together for TGU 3.5 years ago up at DCU, the delegate from Malta, a woman called Ruth Baldacchino, a lovely woman. Could it be that the progress is actually down to the calibre of the activists that you actually have on the ground? And I'm just wondering, from your speech last week, where you did actually raise this very issue, is there an implied criticism of Tenny there for not putting the children's issue as a higher priority? Or was it just
I found Tenny very supportive. No, for me the big difficulty that we faced was there was a lot of misinformation. I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, but I suppose some of the arguments I came up against was that I was proposing surgery on children, even though I never said the word. I've never met anybody in the community who has proposed surgery on a child. So that's me. They also claimed that, oh well, you could have Munchausen syndrome, which is where, you know, a parent will act out. But Munchausen's is a child protection issue. If the parent has Munchausen's, That's a child protection issue, and our child protection legislation will deal with that. So for me, that sort of deliberate misinformation that was being fed into the system, and indeed I've only found in recent weeks that some senators, when I'm talking to them, I said, Jillian, I didn't realise you didn't mean surgery. You didn't. Nobody is talking about surgery on a child. What I'm talking about is having a system when parents agree, when the child agrees, and an independent third person just vouches that everybody agrees. Why not give an interim certificate to that child, so to allow them to go to the school that they wish to go, to be with their peers that they wish to be with. Allow them to do that, allow them to live life, and then when they turn 18, they can statutorily declare or not.
Yeah.
That's their choice.
Yeah. There are actually people out there who are using that surgery argument completely, and in fact they're now getting into what I would call the mischievous, slightly surreal stage of saying, well, can a child be a girl in the morning and a boy in the afternoon? Do you think there is actually people out there with a genuinely nasty agenda, or are they just playing out their fear and loathing in public, is the way I'm calling it? Yeah.
I suppose you have a mix. I suppose the difficulty is, and maybe this is something for the community to consider, is with LGBT, the difficulty is LGB are about sexual orientation. The T is about gender identity, and they're very different.
Yeah.
And I think people conflate and confuse the issues. So I think there are some people who, trans issue is very new to us all. We're learning. We're even trying to learn the correct terminology. I've rang Broden and Tenny sometimes before I go in to speak to the Shannon to ensure that you don't add or add offence. So we are all learning. So so I will give people who are really trying to grapple and understand. So you have that category of people who are genuinely trying to say, what are you on about? What's the story? But then you have, and the difficulty is they tend to be the same group of people that were against children's rights, so they'll all, same group of people who will mischievously and purposely and deliberately feed in information that will scare the general public and make it into something that it's not. And for me, the surgery argument, we need to take it off the table. It is so erroneous, so wrong. I've talked to medical experts and practitioners, and to be absolutely clear, nobody is talking about surgery in a child. The only treatment that you may have is in relation to hormones. If the child was, after going to a specialist, was to undertake that treatment, if, let's say, for whatever reason, in an exceptional case, they decided that they didn't believe anymore that they were that gender, those treatment will wash through their system. So there is no long-term effect on a child for that decision. So the idea that we are preventing children, and there are more children than we realise, certainly in working with our groups like Belong To, they say, they do a lot of amazing work in schools on homophobic bullying, and that has grown. But they've said in recent years, the majority of questions, over 80% of the questions they get from teachers, is about trans children.
Okay.
So that is a prevailing issue. This isn't something that it's about one child in Ireland or two children in Ireland. They have on average 100 children a month dealing with their services on trans children. So these for me are real children in Ireland today that we've said we're not quite comfortable yet. Now I do need to put in the proviso that in fairness the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, James Riley TD, he met with Tenny and he listened to their views, and he was certainly convinced and has said he is now willing to look to see how can we ensure that trans children and their parents can have their rights.
Something that when I have polite discussions with the, shall we say, the alternative view, I won't say they're the opposition, they've invariably said, and we've come to the common ground of saying the rights of the child and the interests of the child must be paramount.
Yeah.
And of course then, depending on whether you look through that as the relationship prism or through the hierarchical prism, what about the rights of the parents? Now, the conclusion I have come to after these years is that essentially, if we're not involved, our role should be to listen, to support. That includes both parents and the child. Yeah. How do you feel we can, particularly in legislation, we can incorporate those values, Julian?
Yeah. Well, for me, that's why I proposed an interim gender recognition certificate where you had consensus, so where parents agreed with a child, okay? we're not yet at a stage where a child doesn't agree with their parents, because we need to build up the data, build up the understanding. But I thought by providing an interim gender recognition certificate, one, we'd raise awareness, because I have countless, and no doubt Michael you would have had the same parents who said, we're worried there was something wrong with our child. If you talk to mental health experts, very often that's where it presents itself, because the child knows that they're not in the right body and feels that they're not, so all these things are presenting themselves. So the parent is extremely worried about the health of their child and what is happening to their child. When they find information about trans and realise that this is what is happening to their child, most parents say, once we can get our head around it, and it is something we all have to get our head around and learn, they go, it's a sense of relief that this is. So for me, is we have to raise awareness, and the state needs to be part of that leadership and say, let's have an interim solution. And I called it interim to make people comfortable. It's not a permanency. And I think for me, what I was surprised of reaching that brick wall that I reached was all too often we say, that the parents trump and it's up to the parents to determine. But on this case, the state has said, we know best, when we don't actually know. The parents do know.
Yeah. When I read this in your speech, and I wasn't really too sure, and I would hope you can elaborate on it for me, I wasn't too sure what practical difference it would make. For instance, one of the arguments I'm hearing all the time from the alternative viewpoint is that, well, we'll all go, it's not uncommon for little boys to dress up in dresses and so on and so forth. There's almost a perception, well, we hope they grow out of it. So I'm just wondering, what practical difference your proposal would make, as opposed to just saying, well, he goes off into that room or she goes off and plays football. What practical...
The very practical difference is it would allow a child to be enrolled in the school of their gender, because the majority of schools in Ireland, like it or not, are single gender. So that's the reality, especially when you get outside Dublin. In Dublin we can have a choice about where we go to school. When you live outside Dublin, you don't have the same choice. So for me this would allow, because schools are absolutely run by your birth certificate. So they get a birth certificate, they will say, you're the wrong gender, so you can't enroll, very basic. And for me it's having a certificate that would overrule that and actually say that child can enroll in this school, they can actually live their life as they wish to live, to try it out. Now, I've also put down on the floor of the Shannon to say, I was a tomboy when I was a child. I never thought I was a boy. I did not want to go to my brother's school. That would have, I found, the most horrid thing. So I think we need to be very careful in our mixing up of what your gender identity is, and in how we act out and in how we play, and because a child puts nail polish on doesn't make them one gender or another. So I think part of me will take the good side of saying, well, maybe people are trying to get more informed about this, but they're also trying to confuse and tap into something that probably many of us had when we were younger, that we, as I said, me being a tomboy, my best pals were boys because they were the similar peers in my road. But I never wanted to go to the boys' school. So let's not mix up the two facts. And what we do know from research is that children's gender identity comes before their sexual orientation. And I think if we went back 20 years ago in Ireland, and you'd probably better, Michael, tell me the facts on this, but we had this belief that at 18 you then decided, what sexual orientation am I going to be? I will decide it. We're now much more enlightened. I believe on gender identity. There are people who still believe it's at 18 you determine your gender identity. And I'm hoping that it won't take us 20 years to realise actually it's something in your very early years is set. And you can't change that compass. And if you try to change that compass in an individual, it will break. And all you need to talk to is mental health specialists who are dealing in this area. They will tell you about children presenting who are trans, who aren't given an option to live their lives as they wish to live.
Can I put something to you? And it was something somebody said to me last week, and I thought these are the sorts of hypothetical cases that people bring up. The case they put to me was that a women's only gym, a mother brings her daughter there, suddenly in the shower room she's confronted with somebody who has a gender recognition certificate and a wedding tackle, as we say. How do you protect that child?
But for me, that's where facilities will have to be developed. We rarely see. You talk to primary school. Anybody who goes to primary school, the children wear their gym gear that day. They wear their tracksuit to school. There is no changing facilities in school. Okay, so if you're talking about a gym, you rarely have communal showers now. They're separate showers. Okay. So this idea that we're going to be presented, it may take some moderation. People need to talk out. We're still getting used to it. But I don't think it's as big a deal as we're making it out to be. Okay. Children on their whole body images are much more withdrawn. Like, we're not sent, if you go to schools now, it's not all sent into a room and changed for gym. As I said, you come in with your gym clothes on. Yeah. So I do think, and talking to principals who have made changes in schools, they said, yes, it took some adjustment, but it wasn't difficult. Yeah.
That's schools though, with say a public or a what I would call a commercial facility, would we have to take a view that, they mightn't have had to put in wheelchair ramps, but because of equality legislation, you have to put in wheelchair ramps. Do we have to say, well, there will be trans people in this area, if you want your child, you're going to have to go to a separate facility. Yeah, do we have to put the onus on the business, I suppose?
Yeah, I think everybody has to. You see in a lot of these places now that they'll have family rooms, they'll have family cubicles for changing, so to allow for privacy. So they just need to change in those. For me, you have to look at each situation. Let's see how we deal with it. But they're not impossible hurdles, and they are things that businesses are constantly evolving and changing. And if their customers are asking for it, it will happen. Yeah.
The other area in that regard then, just around the time of the marriage equality referendum, one of the marriage mothers and fathers matter people, they sent me a recording of a radio interview, and essentially it was a woman saying, my child is trans, and I'm going to... It seemed to me that the initiative was coming from the mother rather than the child. Now, I'm not going to take one interview out of context. And I said to this person, yes, I think there are possibly cases where the parent is the driving force, and we have to protect the children again in that regard. How would your view on legislation focus on that, Jillian?
Well, that's why I was proposing that there would be an independent third person, such as a GP. I picked GP not because of the medical nature, just because their availability locally and they're a trusted professional. So that they would also have to, if a child was to get an interim gender recognition certificate, they would have to be assured that the parents and the child are all of similar opinion. And if you have a case where a parent is trying to put something onto the child, there are issues there in not just about the gender of the child, probably in other issues of where the parent is trying to vicariously live their life through their child, and that needs to be addressed. And that's very often a child protection issue and needs to be addressed by child protection legislation.
Yeah. Last but by no means least, because I know you're rushing off to the floor of the House, Jillian, I am of the view, particularly with children, that to give the best level of support, we also have to take on board a whole range of issues, not just legislative, not just psychological, not just social or family, but aesthetic. And particularly in that sense of the word, you wouldn't say to a 12-year-old kid, you're not wearing glasses because we would help a child like that. One of the problems that I have seen is the way we've evolved up to now is that it's very unfair if somebody is now presenting as a female but they've got large hands and large feet and so on. We can do something about that, and I'm not going to go back into the whole revisit the idea of surgery. Do you think that aesthetic argument is important, or is that something that we still really haven't come to terms with?
I think it is something that will, of course it feeds into, what we see, what we do, and I think any of us to deny that is, you go, oh, okay. But that's for me is where it's about everybody being comfortable in their own body image, and us, very often, in life, whether it's trans or not, you can see people who are confident in their own image and, who can wear something. I'll often say, they could wear that brilliantly, I couldn't do that, so I think that's something, that's a wider societal, and all that body image that's been fed in, all the airbrushing that we see, the unrealistic images that children are getting, all feed into that view that there is a perfect woman and a perfect man, and ideal and all of that. But the reality is, as you live life, as you learn more about life, you actually see beyond anyway body images, and you see, you know, I suppose for me is that you see that inner person, and you're drawn to those good people and the people in life. So yes, it is
very much
pressure.
the story of trans, isn't it?
It's very much the story of trans, and I suppose for me, certainly I would like to thank all of those people in the trans community who had to tell their story to me and to other senators and TDs in order for us to get our head around it and to understand it. But they have done it so convincingly. Why? Because it's authentic, it's true, it's who they are, and that's something that we need to be confident about and let the truth live.
In conclusion then, Jillian, your speech said we haven't finished this work yet. Where do we go from now, particularly in relation to trans children?
Well, where we go for me certainly is, and that's the legislation we're dealing with today, we're beginning dealing with this Children First, which is child protection legislation. I would have preferred another vehicle, but given the support of the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, I'm going to start exploring a way that we can try to ensure that trans children can have the right, and their parents can have a right to a gender recognition certificate, even on an interim or temporary basis, but that we find a way for young people and their parents to allow them to live their life as they wish to live it. So I'll be trying to see with the Children First legislation, and certainly I got permission on the floor of the House from the Minister Kevin Humphreys from the Department of Social Protection that it is the responsibility of the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs. So I will be bringing it forward. We start that legislation today. We'll continue it on in September, October. I certainly would love to hear from anybody in the trans community, any stories you can give me of real examples that your child is having a barrier to participate. It would be really useful because I've seen with legislation, I'm a very evidence-based legislator, but the human story, if we can, people understand, everybody says, hold on, why can't common sense prevail? And all too often I find as a legislator, I'm trying to legislate for common sense. And I hope that that's what we will be able to do in the autumn.
Well, Jillian, 3 years ago, I didn't think we would be able to look the world in the eye and say, look what we've done.
Yeah,
yes, we did.
It is positive.
And it's thanks to people like yourself. So, Jillian Turnout,
we're all together.
Thank you for your time today.
Gonna get up, gonna get up, gonna get up. Oh, oh. Gonna get up, gonna get up.